Fed up with your tax bill? Thinking what's the point? Well, listen in. As a business accountant, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. And as you can imagine, one of the key parts of our job is to explain to people what and how their tax bill has come about, and often break the news. Now, as you can imagine, there's different ends of the spectrum, and some people are quite often sad about the amount they've got to pay in tax. And I thought it'd be a great video just to talk to you about why having a tax bill is actually a good thing. So before we get into it, if you like these type of videos, make sure to click the subscribe button below so you get notified whenever we release another video just like it. So why is it a good thing getting a tax bill? Now, I think the key thing here is it means you've done well. I think most people go into business by themselves because they've got goals of either changing the world or doing something that's going to impact people's lives positively. It could also be financial freedom. There's lots of different reasons, but ultimately for a lot of owners, it comes back to that they want to get paid, they want to make sure they can support their lifestyle, and quite often they see that that's quite an important factor among many things. So of course, when someone says to you, can you pay over a load of money at the end of the year or whenever you're paying your tax, it can be quite deflating for some people. Now, I think I always come back with this thing, and it's quite often delivered with a bit of a cheeky smile, but I say, congratulations, you've got an awesome tax bill. And people look at me a bit funny, and I think that's the way you've got to look at it from a point. I mean, we talk about on this channel and in these videos, and if you've done any work with me or my business, you'll know that, I talk a lot about making sure that you're only paying the right amount of tax, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But ultimately, having a good tax bill means you've done well, It's a little bit like the VAT problem. If you see some of our VAT videos we've done, I'll talk about people trying to make sure that they're not under the threshold, so they don't have to register for VAT and go to that next stage. But ultimately, if you want to be successful, these are things you have to deal with, and tax bills are one of these things. So if you've got a tax bill, that's great. You've done well, congratulations. Of course, the question then is it the right amount that you're paying? Now, just to give you some, and I think this video borders on both moral grounds. There's some discussion here that's probably a bit out of the scope of somebody like me in terms of talking to you about what's morally correct. But just to give you some figures and stats around tax, in the UK, income tax, which is really what we're talking about when in this particular video, which is the tax that employees pay, self-employed people pay, you might pay your dividends, that kind of stuff. Only 42% roughly of people in the UK actually pay it. So, the rest of us have to then pay in to sort of fund all these things that we need. Now, there's a great book if you're ever looking at trying to widen your knowledge on, tax theory or, those kind of moral elements. There's a book called The Joy of Tax. Yes, that's actually a book by a gent named Richard Murphy, which is really nice reading, actually. It gives you sort of one particular opinion on how to view tax. And I think I'm paraphrasing here, but he puts it along the lines of, tax should be seen as almost the government's way of recouping some of the money that it's put into the economy for all the services it does and everything else. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. But ultimately, yes, we need to pay some tax to keep things going. Forget how much detail you want to go into there, but I think most people appreciate that the NHS isn't free ultimately, and we need to do some things to fund it and the like. You can definitely argue about whether it's being spent in the right places and used appropriately, but let's leave that for somebody else for another time. So, but for now, yeah, I think for most people, they understand that tax needs to be paid. Of course, there are those groups, there are those that don't want to pay any, and honestly, I don't think that's something we should be doing. I think we should be looking at paying what's legally right. I think where accountants slip in, and not everybody in our profession, unfortunately, there are people in our profession that do advocate, these evasion schemes and avoidance schemes and all these kind of things. And again, you can argue about the detailed difference between evasion and avoidance, but either way, they're normally aggressive schemes that often are proved not to be useful. There's recently in the news, if you just Google loan charge, you can find out what happened to the people that used those last time. So, but what we talk about in these videos, and on this channel generally, is just paying the right amount of tax. I mean, in the UK, if you're employed, you're probably, 95% plus, I would have said, chance of actually paying the right amount of tax. A computer applies the tax law, which is relatively straightforward on an employee's pay, and it churns out a tax bill that gets paid over every month. Everybody's happy, it works. The problem is, when you're in business, you've got to navigate roughly 22,000 pages, okay, not all of it at once, but a large portion of it, to be able to pay the right amount of tax. And then on top of that, you've got the tax courts, which are changing, daily, arguably, and how we deal with things. I can think of travel being a great example. Travel's changed quite vastly of what you can deduct as travel expenses over the last, say, 5-6 years. And I'm sure things will continue to move as we do them. And so much of it's a judgment call. There is no kind of rule book. And it's navigating all that. So these videos and generally accountants, the good guys anyway, are there to just make sure that we're paying the right amount of tax. And that can work both ways. I've seen plenty of tax returns we get and we have to tell people the bad news of, do you know what, you've actually been overclaiming here. But I think vastly more we see where they're too scared of doing anything wrong and they've underclaimed. I can think of at least 2 examples this week where I've spoken to somebody who hasn't put anything in. They've just gone, okay, all the absolute bare minimum because they're worried about getting it wrong. Didn't even know about the trading allowance, for example, which is a video on this channel. If you're starting off as a sole trader, definitely look at that one. And all these things so they're actually paying more tax than they need to, which is obviously going to have a negative impact on their business growth. And I think if you're looking to do cool things as an entrepreneur or a small business owner and employ people and generate money for the economy, you want that cash in your business, not paying more than you need to. It's critically important for your business growth. So when we're talking about reducing your tax bill, they're the kind of things we're talking about. But of course, the other benefit of doing well and paying tax is you're going to have provable income. So at least, I don't know, I probably couldn't put a figure on it, but a lot of times during a year, we will have people come to us who've come from other accountants who are, or doing it themselves. And let's say they've been the other side of what I think is fair and acceptable. And they're now want to make sure that they're actually doing what they should be doing appropriately and declaring the right amount of tax and everything else. And one of the driving factors is what happens is they've all been happy for years, with these super low tax bills, and then of course they go to get a mortgage or that dream house, or they want some funding for something, and of course they've got no provable earnings anywhere, and it's a shocking state of affairs. So paying a decent sized tax bill means you've got good earnings, means you can prove those earnings, means you can borrow money for that dream house or whatever you want. And I think that's always a cool moment for us when somebody can see that they've worked hard and managed to get that house that they've worked for, because at the end of the day, getting a mortgage as a self-employed person is not that much more difficult than getting it as an employed person, but you obviously have to show the profits, and as we've mentioned, getting the right taxable profits is a very difficult thing. So do look on it favourably when it's happened, because I'm sure when you started your business, you would have been more concerned about making sure you had enough money to pay your bills. So paying the tax bill and figuring out, is that right? Is there better ways of structuring this to make sure we're paying the legal minimum that we need to pay? Then that's the next challenge really in your business. So then I guess the best thing to leave you with is some action points, some practical things. What can you do to make sure you are paying the right amount of tax? Obviously, completely obvious, and that's get some professional advice if you can. At the end of the day, there's a reason I don't do DIY, because I'm rubbish at it, and there's more efficient ways of doing it, so I get somebody in to do it. I'd be the same with the tax. You can spend all of your time Googling. There's some great information out there. There's YouTube channels and blogs and all sorts that are out there talking to you about this stuff, but ultimately for one-on-one bespoke advice, it's best to get something with an accountant and speak to them. But aside from that, do your research, know what's possible, have some knowledge of things, because quite often, especially if you already have an accountant and you're not 100% convinced they know what they're talking about, it is worth you doing a little bit of a couple of checks to see, because unfortunately the world moves so fast. If your accountant isn't moving fast and keeping up with it, they can be out of date very, very quick. So bear that in mind. So do some research yourself, but ultimately get the best advice you can on that. And then the other one is, even at a base level, if you're just starting out and you're thinking, do you know what, I haven't got the budget for that kind of stuff, have a look at like HMRC webinars. They do some relatively good information just as a base level of what you can do that tells you about some of these things. So they're not actually the worst place to start. So make sure you're doing that, make sure you're doing your research, and just know what's possible. Aside from that, keep great records. That's probably the number one thing I would always say. And if you've heard me talk on this subject before, you'll know I talk about great records being the key of everything. Because if you pay, let's say you pay something cash when you're out and about, you get the receipt in your pocket, goes in the wash, you didn't put it in your records, you've got nothing in your bank account, so you actually can't even remember spending the money, you've lost your tax deduction, and by default you're paying more tax. So there you go, a couple of ideas to keep you going, and in the meantime, don't cry too much with these tax bills, just make sure you're happy that they're correct and enjoy the fact you've been successful. We'll see you in the next one.